Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of the Appalachian Mountains. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The vast ancient ridges of the Appalachian Mountains hold countless untold stories within their misty hollows and dense forests. Among them, perhaps none has remained so deliberately obscured from public record as the case of the Blackwood Sisters of McDowell County, West Virginia. For nearly 7 decades, their story remained hidden in fragmented local records, sealed testimonies, and the fading memories of those who once lived near the remote property locals came to call the Sisters Ridge. What follows is a careful reconstruction of events based on declassified documents, personal testimonies, and the meticulous research of those who dared to ask questions no one seemed to want answered. The Appalachian Mountains themselves form a backdrop that seems almost designed for disappearance. One of the oldest mountain ranges on Earth, they have witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations, their worn peaks and hidden valleys creating a landscape where isolation is not merely possible, but inevitable. For generations, these mountains have sheltered those seeking to escape from the law, from society, from the past. The Blackwood Sisters, it seems, sought to escape from limitations far more fundamental than mere social constraints. They came to these ancient hills to challenge the boundaries of reality itself. It was in the spring of 1952 when Dr. Martin Holloway, a folklorist from Marshall University, stumbled upon a series of unusual entries in the McDowell County Clerk's office while researching Appalachian oral traditions. What began as academic curiosity would lead him down a path so disturbing that his subsequent research notes were never formally published. According to university archives, Holloway abandoned his academic career shortly after submitting a manuscript that was promptly rejected by his department head and allegedly sealed in the university's restricted collections. The official reason cited was methodological concerns, but interviews with former colleagues suggest more troubling objections to his findings. Martin changed after he began that research, recalled Dr. James Harrison, a fellow professor who shared an office with Holloway. He'd always been methodical, skeptical, a consummate academic, but something about those sisters got under his skin. He started talking about voices that shouldn't exist and consciousness untethered from time. When the university rejected his work, he didn't seem surprised. Some truths aren't meant for academic journals, he told me. Some discoveries should remain hidden. I thought he was being dramatic at the time. Now, I'm not so sure. The Blackwood sisters, Martha, Agnes, and Josephine, first came to McDowell County sometime in the late 1920s, purchasing a remote 40-acre property approximately 12 miles from the nearest town of Welch. County records show the deed was transferred from the Hargrave Coal Company to Martha Blackwood, the eldest sister, who paid the considerable sum of $30,200 in cash, an amount that raised questions even then about how 3 unmarried women had acquired such wealth. The property itself was notable for its isolation, situated in a narrow valley with steep ridges on 3 sides and accessible only by a single dirt road that became nearly impassable during winter months. The deed transfer, recorded by County Clerk Walter Simmons on October 17, 1927, contained an unusual stipulation that the property could never be subdivided and must remain in the ownership of Martha Blackwood or her direct female descendants in perpetuity. Such conditions were highly uncommon in property transactions of the era, particularly in rural West Virginia, where land speculation was common. When questioned about this stipulation years later by Holloway, the elderly Simmons recalled that Martha had been insistent on this point, stating that the integrity of the location must be preserved for the work to continue across generations. The sisters were immediately set apart from the tight-knit Appalachian communities that dotted the region. They avoided church gatherings, town meetings, and maintained minimal contact with neighbors. According to statements collected years later, the Blackwoods were seen in town perhaps once every 2 months, always together, always dressed in identical high-necked dresses, regardless of the season, and always completing their business with a brisk efficiency that discouraged conversation. They weren't unfriendly exactly, recalled Eleanor Mathis, then a young woman working at Welch General Store, in a statement recorded in 1957. They just had this way about them, like they were observing everything, but didn't want to be observed themselves. They'd purchase large quantities of unusual items, salt by the barrel, canning jars by the crate, medical supplies that most folks would get from a doctor. And they always paid in cash, with bills so crisp and new it was as if they'd just been printed. Mathis also noted a peculiar habit the sisters exhibited during their visits. They would sometimes stop mid-motion, all three at once, and remain perfectly still for several seconds, like statues. Then they'd resume as if nothing had happened. And sometimes they'd speak to each other in this odd way, where one would start a sentence and another would finish it without any hesitation. Not like they were interrupting, but like they were sharing the same thought. Another local merchant, hardware store owner Frank Donnelly, noted in his business ledger that the sisters regularly purchased unusual quantities of electrical components, copper wire, and specialized tools more commonly associated with industrial applications than household use. "Asked Miss Martha once what they were building out there," Donnelly told Holloway during an interview. "She just smiled real thin-like and said they were improving upon existing methodologies." Didn't know what to make of talk like that from women living so far out in the hills. Donnelly's ledger, preserved in the County Historical Society's archives, contains detailed records of the sisters' purchases over a period of nearly 15 years. The pattern of acquisitions suggests a progression in whatever project they were undertaking, beginning with basic electrical components and gradually advancing to highly specialized equipment, including vacuum tubes imported from Germany, specialized recording devices, and what are described as temporal measuring instruments obtained through a scientific supply company in Philadelphia. The Blackwood property itself became the subject of local speculation. Situated on a steep north-facing slope, the main house was barely visible from the single dirt road that approached it. Delivery men reported that they were never permitted past a small outbuilding at the property's edge, where goods would be left and payment collected from an envelope tacked to the door. The sisters had explicitly indicated they valued their privacy and had legally posted the entirety of their land against trespassers, an unusual move in a region where neighborly access to hunting and foraging grounds was customary. Aerial photographs of the property taken during a geological survey in 1936 revealed several unusual features not visible from the road. These included what appeared to be a series of concentric circles cleared in the forest behind the main house, multiple small outbuildings arranged in a precise geometric pattern, and what one surveyor described as anomalous ground disturbances suggesting extensive subsurface modifications. These photographs were subsequently removed from public records and are known today only through descriptions in Holloway's notes. Local mail carrier Horace Webb noted in a 1956 interview that the sisters received an unusual volume of correspondence from destinations including Washington, D.C., Vienna, Austria, and occasionally Cambridge, Massachusetts. Heavy parcels, too, Webb recalled, marked scientific materials or fragile instruments, needed special handling. And they'd always know exactly when to expect them, waiting by the drop point, even in the worst weather. Webb's daily log, which he maintained meticulously throughout his career and later donated to the County Historical Society, contained several entries regarding unusual occurrences at the Blackwood property. One, dated November 12, 1932, reads, "Approached Sisters Ridge at 2:17 p.m. with registered package from Vienna. Before reaching property, heard women's voices in animated conversation, though no one visible. Upon arrival at drop point, found all three sisters waiting. Miss Martha commented that I was precisely on time, though I had arrived 7 minutes earlier than scheduled. When I mentioned the voices, They exchanged glances, and Miss Josephine stated, "The acoustics of these mountains can be quite deceptive," left with distinct impression that my approach had been observed well before I was within visual range of the property. What might have remained merely an odd footnote in local history took a darker turn in the winter of 1938, when severe blizzards isolated much of McDowell County for nearly 3 weeks. As communities rallied to check on isolated homesteads, the county sheriff dispatched Deputy Roy Callahan to verify the welfare of those in the most remote areas, including the Blackwood sisters. What Callahan discovered at the property was documented in a single-page report that was later found among Dr. Holloway's research materials. The report, terse and factual, noted that upon approaching the main house, Callahan observed smoke from the chimney but received no response to repeated knocking. Concerned, he circled the property and reported observing through a partially curtained window what appeared to be evidence of occupation and unusual structural modifications to the interior walls. When he finally received a response, it came in the form of a firmly worded note slipped beneath the door, assuring him of their well-being and requesting that he depart immediately. Callahan's report contained one detail that would later take on disturbing significance. He noted that while standing on the porch, he detected a persistent sound, mechanical in nature, emanating from below the floorboards, suggesting the operation of equipment in a cellar or lower level of the home. When questioned about this by Dr. Holloway years later, Callahan, by then retired, elaborated that the sound had resembled the workings of a large clock or possibly a recording device, though unlike any I had encountered before or since. There was something else, Callahan confided in Holloway, according to the latter's notes, something I didn't put in the report because it seemed too inexplicable. While I was standing there, I distinctly heard women's voices in conversation, but they weren't coming from inside the house. They seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, like they were carried on the wind itself. I heard one say quite clearly, "The integration remains incomplete." Another responded, "Patience, the substrate requires time to adapt." Made no sense to me then or now. When I finally left, I had the strangest sensation of being followed all the way back to town, though I never saw a soul on that road. Callahan's personal journal, discovered among his effects after his death in 1959, contained additional observations not included in his official report or even shared with Holloway. An entry dated February 7, 1938, reads, "Cannot shake the feeling that something fundamental has been altered in my perception since visiting the Blackwood property. Twice now I have found myself completing routine tasks with no memory of having begun them. Last night, Margaret, his wife, claims I spoke in my sleep for over an hour, reciting what she described as scientific formulas in a voice unlike my own. I have never studied science beyond basic requirements and possess no knowledge that would explain this. Am increasingly convinced that whatever the Blackwood sisters are engaged in extends beyond the boundaries of their physical property. Will not be returning there under any circumstances." The next significant entry in the Blackwood sisters' timeline came in July of 1943, when a local hunter named Samuel Thorne reported to authorities that while tracking a wounded deer that had strayed onto the Blackwood property, he had observed peculiar light patterns emanating from what appeared to be ventilation structures partially hidden among the trees approximately 400 yards behind the main house. Thorne's report was dismissed by local authorities as a likely misidentification of natural phenomena, particularly as the sisters promptly filed a complaint against him for trespassing. Thorne, however, maintained until his death in 1962 that what he had witnessed was neither natural nor easily explained. "Weren't like any lights I ever seen," he insisted in a recorded interview with Holloway. "Moved in patterns, like they was responding to something. And there was sounds coming up from those vents, sounds like voices speaking some foreign tongue, but all mixed together, layered like, as if a dozen people were talking at once, but at different speeds." In a letter to his brother dated August 3, 1943, Thorne provided additional details that suggest his experience may have been more disturbing than he was willing to admit publicly. I cannot shake the feeling that what I saw at the Blackwood place wasn't just lights and sounds, but something looking back at me, studying me. Since that day, I've had the same dream every night. I'm standing in a white room, and 3 women I've never seen before are circling me, speaking words I can't understand. They keep pointing to my head, like they're discussing something about my thoughts. I wake each time with the same phrase in my mind, though I don't know what it means. The observer changes what is observed. Think I'll stay clear of Sisters Ridge from now on. Some places aren't meant for men to go. During the war years of 1941-1945, the Blackwood Sisters' isolation seemed to intensify. According to postal records, they temporarily halted all deliveries to the property for a period of 14 months, and locals reported that their infrequent appearances in town ceased entirely. When they resumed contact in late 1945, those who encountered them noted subtle but disturbing changes in their demeanor. They'd always been odd birds, but now there was something more to it, recalled pharmacy owner James Whitaker. They moved differently, more fluid-like, but also somehow mechanical in their precision. And they would sometimes pause mid-sentence, all 3 of them at once, as if listening to something nobody else could hear. Then they'd resume speaking in perfect unison. Gave me cold chills every time. Whitaker's pharmacy records, preserved in the County Historical Society archives, show a significant change in the sisters' purchasing patterns after their period of isolation. Where previously they had ordered conventional medical supplies such as bandages, antiseptics, and basic medications, their post-war purchases included specialized chemicals used primarily in neurological research, preservation solutions typically employed in laboratory settings, and compounds associated with experimental treatments for cognitive disorders. These purchases were always accompanied by formal letters on letterhead, bearing the insignia of a government agency whose name had been deliberately obscured. A particularly troubling account comes from Reverend Thomas Matthews, who encountered Agnes Blackwood alone on a rare occasion in the winter of 1946. She was waiting at the train station in Welch, though no train was due for hours, Matthews reported. I approached to offer assistance, thinking perhaps she was unwell, as she stood so still in the falling snow. When I addressed her, she turned to me with an expression I can only describe as vacant, yet somehow calculating. She asked me a most peculiar question. "Do you ever feel that your thoughts are not entirely your own, Reverend?" Before I could respond, she continued, "We have found that consciousness is more permeable than previously understood. Voices from elsewhere can occupy the same space, given the proper conditions." She then smiled in a manner that suggested she was repeating a gesture she had observed rather than felt, and walked away. Matthew's personal diary, shared with Holloway years later, contained a disturbing postscript to this encounter. For weeks afterward, I found myself awakening at precisely 3:17 a.m. each morning with a distinct impression that someone had just spoken to me. Most troubling of all, I discovered pages of writings in my own hand that I have no memory of producing, dense technical descriptions of what appear to be experimental procedures involving consciousness transference and temporal displacement of cognitive processes. I have burned these pages and have begun to pray daily for protection against whatever influence the Blackwood woman may have exerted upon me during our brief encounter. An intriguing connection emerged in Holloway's research when he discovered that during the sisters' period of isolation coinciding with World War II, a classified government project codenamed Echo Chamber had been established to investigate potential applications of what limited documents described as non-traditional communication methodologies. The project, housed within the Office of Strategic Services, predecessor to the CIA, employed several European émigré scientists with specializations in neurology, electrical, engineering, and linguistics, the exact fields in which the Blackwood sisters had expertise. On 3 occasions, my wife reports that I rose from bed, walked to my study, and sat at my desk for exactly 17 minutes before returning to bed, though I have no recollection of doing so. While no direct evidence links the sisters to this project, a partially redacted memo from 1944 mentions field researchers in the Appalachian region who have achieved promising results using modified equipment in an isolated environmental context. The memo further notes that the W sisters continue to report anomalous results that exceed theoretical parameters, suggesting possible breakthroughs of significant interest to military intelligence. For the next decade, the Blackwood sisters continued their isolated existence without incident in official records. Then, in April of 1954, the local postmaster noted that mail had begun to accumulate in their box. After 2 weeks without collection, unprecedented in their otherwise methodical habits, the sheriff's department was notified. Sheriff William Dawson, accompanied by Deputy Carl Richards, conducted a welfare check at the property on April 28, 1954. Their official report, later sealed by court order, but partially reconstructed through Holloway's notes, documented that the main house appeared to have been vacant for some time. The doors were unlocked, itself an anomaly in the security-conscious household the sisters had maintained. Inside they discovered a home meticulously organized, but with certain troubling inconsistencies. The interior was immaculate, Sheriff Dawson noted. Not a dish out of place, not a speck of dust on any surface. Yet the calendar on the kitchen wall was turned to August 1953, suggesting no one had been present for at least 8 months. 3 bedrooms showed evidence of recent occupation, with clothing laid out as if for the next day. Personal items, such as hairbrushes, reading glasses, and jewelry were in place, indicating the sisters had not packed for a planned departure. Deputy Richards's supplemental notes, obtained by Holloway through a personal connection in the sheriff's office, included observations omitted from the official report. The house felt wrong, Richards wrote. Temperature varied dramatically from room to room. Some areas were freezing cold despite the mild spring day outside. In one bedroom, apparently belonging to the youngest sister, Josephine, I observed what appeared to be burn marks on the wooden floor, forming a perfect circle approximately 6 feet in diameter. Inside this circle, the floorboards were discolored in a way consistent with extreme heat exposure, yet nothing else in the room showed signs of fire damage. Richards's personal journal, discovered among his effects after his death in 1967, contained additional observations too disturbing to include in his official report. Throughout our search of the house, I experienced what I can only describe as auditory hallucinations. Women's voices engaged in technical discussions that seemed to follow us from room to room, though the source remained untraceable. At one point, I distinctly heard a voice directly behind me say, "The observers have arrived earlier than anticipated. Adjustment to parameters required." When I turned, no one was there. Sheriff Dawson gave no indication of hearing these voices, and I refrained from mentioning them for fear of appearing unstable. What prompted Dawson to expand the search beyond the main house was the discovery of a ledger found in what appeared to be Martha Blackwood's desk. The ledger, containing precise notations in a meticulous hand, detailed maintenance schedules for what was referred to only as the lower facility. The final entry, dated August 17, 1953, contained the cryptic notation, "Secondary seal compromised. Containment measures initiated. Final protocol may be required if pressure readings continue to increase." The ledger also contained a series of technical drawings and equations that Dawson, a former engineer before his law enforcement career, recognized as far beyond conventional scientific knowledge of the era. These calculations appear to reference quantum field theories not yet fully developed, he noted in a private memorandum, later discovered among his personal effects. The technical sophistication suggests knowledge that should not exist in the private sector, particularly not in the possession of 3 women with no known institutional affiliations. Among the most disturbing elements in the ledger were detailed anatomical drawings of the human brain annotated with what appeared to be modifications to specific regions. Notes in the margin described optimal placement of receptor nodes and necessary neural adaptations for sustained transference. One page contained a diagram of 3 human figures with their cranial regions connected by lines to a central apparatus, accompanied by the notation, "Triangulation remains the optimal configuration for signal coherence across temporal boundaries." This led Dawson and Richards to explore the heavily wooded area behind the house, where they discovered what initial reports described as a concrete structure resembling a storm cellar but of unusual dimensions and apparent depth. The door to this structure was secured with an elaborate locking mechanism that required the assistance of a locksmith from Welch to open. What they found inside has been largely redacted from official records, with only fragments available through cross-referenced testimonies and Holloway's incomplete research. What is clear is that the storm cellar was merely the entrance to a much more extensive subterranean structure that extended deep into the hillside. Engineering assessments conducted later would estimate the facility encompassed approximately 3,000 square feet of space divided into multiple chambers, all connected by narrow corridors with sealed doorways. The facility appeared to serve multiple purposes, with different chambers containing what were described in the inventory as recording equipment of advanced design, document storage in environmentally controlled conditions, and most disturbingly, medical apparatus consistent with extended patient monitoring. Power was supplied by a sophisticated system involving both connection to the municipal electrical grid and backup generators. Most significant was a sealed chamber at the lowest level, which showed signs of recent catastrophic damage, including what appeared to be evidence of fire and water damage consistent with some form of containment breach. Inside this chamber, investigators documented finding 3 sets of personal effects, including items identified as belonging to each of the Blackwood sisters, but no human remains. One particularly troubling detail, mentioned only in Richards's personal journal, was the discovery of what he described as 3 chairs arranged in a triangular configuration, each equipped with restraints and connected to a central apparatus that appeared to be designed for direct cranial attachment. The chairs showed evidence of recent use and, according to Richards, bore distinct impressions in their padding, suggesting that the occupants had experienced violent convulsions shortly before vacating them. The locksmith who assisted in accessing the facility, Malcolm Reed, later suffered a mental breakdown that his wife attributed directly to what he had witnessed inside the subterranean structure. "He came home that day white as a sheet," Mrs. Reed told Holloway. "Wouldn't speak a word about what he'd seen except to say that those women had found a way to keep talking after they should have stopped. He woke up screaming every night for weeks afterward, saying he could hear voices coming through the walls of our bedroom, women's voices speaking words that made no sense." In a particularly disturbing development, Reed began to exhibit knowledge of advanced electrical engineering concepts, despite having no formal education beyond high school. His wife reported finding him in his workshop at night, constructing intricate devices using components he had never worked with before. He said the voices were telling him how to build something that would complete the circuit, she recalled. When I asked what circuit, he looked at me with an expression that wasn't his own and said, "The one that spans the gap between what was, what is, and what will be." 3 days later, he was committed to Lakin State Hospital after attempting to attach homemade electrodes to his temples. The investigation that followed was remarkably brief and contained. Within 48 hours of the discovery, federal authorities arrived in McDowell County and assumed jurisdiction over the case. The property was cordoned off, and all materials from the underground facility were removed to undisclosed locations. County officials and those involved in the initial discovery were required to sign confidentiality agreements under the National Security Act. The official explanation provided to the public came in the form of a brief article in the Welch Daily News on May 3, 1954, stating that the Blackwood sisters had been involved in classified research during World War II and had likely relocated to continue their work elsewhere. The property was designated as formerly associated with government research and placed under federal oversight, effectively removing it from local jurisdiction or access. Sheriff Dawson, who had led the initial investigation, was observed by colleagues to undergo a significant personality change following the federal intervention. Bill was never the same after they took over that case, recalled former Deputy Michael Collins. He'd been a thorough, detail-oriented lawman for 20 years, but suddenly he couldn't seem to focus on even basic reports. He'd stare into space for minutes at a time, then snap back and continue a conversation that had ended an hour earlier. Sometimes he'd speak about the Blackwood sisters in the present tense, as if they were right there in the room. He took early retirement 6 months later. Last I heard, he was living like a hermit up in the hills, covering his walls with equations nobody could make sense of. Local journalist Howard Klein attempted to pursue the story, but found his inquiries blocked at every turn. Sources that had previously been willing to speak with me suddenly became unreachable or claimed to have no recollection of matters they had discussed openly just days earlier, Klein wrote in an unpublished manuscript found among Holloway's papers. One county clerk who had provided me access to property records was replaced overnight, and the new appointee claimed certain files had been transferred to federal archives for routine digitization, this in 1954, when such technology was in its infancy. Klein's persistence would ultimately cost him his career and possibly his sanity. His editor at the Welch Daily News, under pressure from unspecified federal agencies, terminated his employment in June 1954. Klein's subsequent attempts to publish his findings independently were met with legal threats, and what he described in personal correspondence as surveillance so obvious it was clearly meant to intimidate rather than remain covert. In his final known writing, a letter to Dr. Holloway dated November 1955, Klein described experiencing phenomena similar to those reported by others who had investigated the Blackwood case. "I hear their voices now, Dr. Holloway. Not just in dreams, but in waking life. They discuss me as if I were a specimen under observation. They debate the effectiveness of what they call the imprinting. Most disturbing of all, I sometimes find myself responding to them in words I do not recognize as my own. I fear that whatever the Blackwood sisters were attempting to create, it did not die with their disappearance. It merely found new vessels to occupy." Klein was committed to Western State Hospital in December 1955, diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. His medical records, partially accessed by Holloway through professional connections, contain troubling notations by attending physicians. Patient exhibits unusual coherence in delusional framework, with technical knowledge of neurological processes inconsistent with his educational background. Claims to be receiving information from the sisters who exist beyond time. Most concerning is his ability to accurately predict staff rotations and facility events before they are announced. This might have been the end of the story, a curious footnote in local history gradually forgotten as decades passed. However, Dr. Holloway's discovery of inconsistencies in this narrative would eventually lead to the partial reconstruction of what may have actually transpired at the Blackwood property. Through persistent research and interviews with reluctant locals conducted between 1952 and 1957, Holloway compiled evidence suggesting the Blackwood sisters' story began not in West Virginia, but in Vienna, Austria, circa 1919. Immigration records indicated that 3 sisters with the surname Schwarzwald, the German equivalent of Blackwood, arrived at Ellis Island in November of that year. Their listed occupations were intriguing: Martha, 33, research physician; Agnes, 31, electrical engineer; and Josephine, 27, linguistics specialist. The timing of their emigration coincided with the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire following World War I, but Holloway uncovered evidence suggesting their departure may have been motivated by more than political upheaval. Fragmentary academic records from the University of Vienna indicated that Martha Schwarzwald had been involved in controversial neurological research that had been abruptly terminated in early 1919, following what was described only as ethical concerns raised by the faculty committee. A single surviving letter, written by a former colleague and addressed to Martha at her first American address in New York, alluded to these concerns. While I understand your frustration with the committee's decision, I must confess that your latest experimental protocols ventured into territories that even our liberal institution cannot sanction. The boundary between observer and subject cannot be so casually transgressed, regardless of the potential knowledge to be gained. Some doors, once opened, cannot be easily closed again. Further investigation by Holloway revealed that the sisters had been associated with a small private research institute in Vienna known as Die Gesellschaft für Kognitive Erweiterung, the Society for Cognitive Enhancement. The institute, founded in 1912 by a group of scientists and philosophers dissatisfied with conventional limitations on human consciousness research, had explored various methods for expanding perception and cognition, including early experiments with electrical stimulation of the brain, psychoactive compounds derived from rare botanical sources, and what they termed consciousness transference protocols. The Institute's records were largely destroyed during the political upheaval following World War I, but fragments preserved in private collections suggest the Schwarzwald sisters had been central to its most ambitious and controversial work, attempting to create what was described as a methodology for preserving conscious experience independent of biological constraints. Their work apparently drew upon emerging theories in quantum physics, particularly those related to non-locality and wave function, applied in novel ways to neurological processes. The sisters' European backgrounds were carefully obscured upon their arrival in America. They spent several years in Washington, D.C., where fragmentary employment records suggested connections to government research facilities. Their abrupt relocation to the isolated Appalachian property coincided with increased scrutiny of foreign-born specialists following a series of espionage concerns in the late 1920s. Holloway discovered that during their time in Washington, the sisters had been briefly affiliated with a classified research program examining potential applications of radio technology for non-traditional information transfer, a euphemism that appears to have encompassed early experiments in what would later be termed psychological operations. Their contributions to this program were significant enough that when they abruptly resigned in 1927, citing a desire to pursue independent research pathways, the government facilitated their relocation to West Virginia and apparently provided ongoing financial support through channels designed to obscure the source of funding. What exactly the Blackwood sisters were researching in their hidden facility remains largely speculative, but certain documents recovered by Holloway suggest it involved advanced communications technologies and what was described in one partially redacted memo as methodologies for information extraction and retention outside of conventional limitations. One local resident, who requested anonymity even in Holloway's private notes, claimed to have been employed briefly as a delivery person to the property in the mid-1940s and reported overhearing the sisters discussing what sounded like ways to preserve thoughts beyond their natural endpoint. This same informant reported an unsettling experience while delivering a package of specialized vacuum tubes to the property in the summer of 1946. I was instructed to wait while Miss Agnes inspected the contents. While standing in the small receiving area, I distinctly heard a woman's voice coming from what appeared to be an early type of intercom system. The voice was speaking rapidly in German, which I recognized from my military service. What struck me as odd was that the voice seemed to be responding to questions no one had asked, as if carrying on half of a conversation. When I mentioned hearing the voice, Miss Agnes gave me a strange look and said, "That would be impossible. We are the only 3 people on this property." Yet the voice continued speaking for several minutes afterwards. In his journal entry from that same evening, the deliveryman noted, "Cannot shake the feeling that I heard something I wasn't supposed to hear today." The voice on that intercom wasn't just speaking German, it was speaking about me, describing my physical characteristics and speculating about my cognitive capacity. I understood enough to recognize phrases like limited perceptual framework and potential receiver candidate. When I left the property, I experienced a 17-minute gap in my memory. I found myself nearly a mile down the road with no recollection of having traveled that distance. The most disturbing aspect of Holloway's research came from his final interviews, conducted in early 1957 with Eliza Jenkins, an elderly resident of a nearby hollow, who claimed to have been occasionally employed by the Blackwoods as a domestic helper in the 1930s. According to Jenkins, she was never permitted access to certain portions of the main house, let alone the structures behind it, but on several occasions observed unusual behaviors that troubled her deeply. They would sometimes speak to each other in ways that didn't make sense, Jenkins told Holloway. Not just the German, I expected that, but the way they'd suddenly stop mid-conversation, like they were listening to something nobody else could hear. And then they'd continue as if someone else had spoken in between. Miss Martha once told me they were never really alone in that house, said it like it was a comfort, but it chilled me to the bone. Jenkins also reported that during her last visit to the property in 1936, she observed what appeared to be extensive burn scarring on Agnes Blackwood's hands and forearms. When asked about the injury, Agnes had replied, "Some knowledge can only be gained through fire." She said, "We have found a way to make the echoes speak first, before the voice has even called out." I didn't understand then, and I don't understand now. But the way she said it, like it was the most natural thing in the world, that's what frightened me more than anything else. In a particularly unsettling revelation, Jenkins confided that in the decades since her last visit to the Blackwood property, she had occasionally experienced what she described as visitations from the high. Sisters, not physical appearances, but rather a sensation of their presence, accompanied by whispered conversations just at the edge of audibility. Some voices only speak through pain. Jenkins never returned to the property after that encounter. "The last thing Miss Martha said to me as I was leaving that day has stayed with me all these years," Jenkins told Holloway. "They discuss me as if I'm not there," Jenkins explained. "They talk about the impression they left on me, and how it's maintained stability over time. Sometimes they argue about whether I'd make a suitable vessel. I don't know what that means, and I don't want to know." Of particular interest in Holloway's research were his attempts to reconstruct the layout and purpose of the underground facility based on accounts from those briefly involved in its discovery. According to these descriptions, the central chamber of the facility contained what appeared to be 3 modified medical examination chairs arranged in a triangle, each connected to what one observer described as a complex array of recording devices and electrical components unlike anything in conventional use. A partial inventory list discovered in Holloway's papers after his death described additional equipment including vacuum tube arrays exceeding standard computational requirements by orders of magnitude, modified electroencephalographic recording devices with unprecedented sensitivity, and most cryptically, temporal phase inverters, experimental design, quantity. 3. The technical sophistication of the facility was emphasized in a memo from a government scientist who briefly examined the site before it was sealed. The equipment configuration suggests capabilities at least 2 decades beyond current technological parameters. Of particular note is the integration of neurological monitoring systems with what appears to be an advanced analog computational network designed to process and store patterns of electrical activity identical to those produced by the human brain during cognitive processes. If the purpose of this facility is what I suspect, the recording and potential transfer of consciousness itself, then the Blackwood research represents either a catastrophic breach of security protocols or an independent breakthrough that exceeds our own classified progress in this field by a significant margin. The final piece of Holloway's research, and perhaps the most compelling, came from his discovery of a series of vinyl recordings in the Marshall University archives. These recordings, unmarked except for dates ranging from 1932 to 1947, contained what sound engineers later identified as layered audio with multiple tracks recorded over one another in a technique that would not become standard practice until decades later. When isolated and enhanced, certain segments appeared to contain conversations among the sisters discussing what they referred to as the methodology. One partially intelligible segment, dated October 1944, included the following exchange. Martha's voice. The separation continues to progress. Subject C has maintained coherence for 72 hours now. Agnes's voice. The integrity of the carrier remains my primary concern. Degradation accelerates with each iteration. Unidentified voice, possibly Josephine. They are speaking more clearly now. The voices from Vienna, from before. They remember what we cannot. A second recording, dated March 1946, contained a more troubling exchange. Martha. The temporal displacement exceeds our initial parameters. Yesterday I distinctly heard my own voice describing an experiment we have not yet conducted. Josephine. I have been dreaming in languages I do not speak. Last night it was Russian discussing quantum field equations that align precisely with our current calculations. Agnes. The boundary thins further each day. I sometimes feel that we are merely echoing conversations that have already occurred elsewhere, or perhaps have yet to occur at all. A third recording, dated December 1947, captures what appears to be a heated disagreement among the sisters. Agnes. The feedback loop is becoming unstable. We cannot proceed with Phase 4 without addressing the temporal anomalies. Martha. There is no turning back now. The voices from the other side have confirmed that the transfer is possible. We have seen the evidence in our own experiences. Josephine. But what if what we're hearing isn't from the other side at all? What if we've simply created a system that allows our future selves to communicate with our present? Isn't that worth any risk? The recordings abruptly end in March 1947, with a final entry consisting primarily of static, punctuated by what audio analysts described as mechanical rhythmic patterns inconsistent with any known recording equipment of the era. Buried within this static, when subjected to advanced filtering techniques not available until the 1990s, voice fragments can be detected repeating a single phrase in German, Wir sind nicht mehr allein in uns selbst. Translated, we are no longer alone within ourselves. Technical analysis of these recordings conducted by audio specialists at Holloway's request yielded disturbing conclusions. The ethical implications. Martha, interrupting. Ethics are a luxury we can no longer afford. The work is too important. If we succeed, death itself becomes merely a transitional state, consciousness preserved indefinitely. The layering technique employed is not simply multiple recordings superimposed, noted sound engineer Robert Chambers in his report. Rather, it appears that multiple conversations occurring at different points in time have somehow been captured simultaneously on the same medium, an effect that should be technologically impossible. More troubling is the frequency analysis, which shows patterns consistent with what we would now recognize as digital encoding techniques, decades before such methods were developed. The implications are unsettling. Either the Blackwood sisters possessed technology far beyond anything available in the 1940s, or they had somehow developed a method for recording conversations before they actually occurred. Dr. Holloway's research came to an abrupt end in December 1957, when he was involved in a single-vehicle accident on Route 52 near Bluefield. His death was ruled accidental, though certain inconsistencies in the accident report were noted by local journalists but never published. His collected materials on the Blackwood case were supposedly transferred to Marshall University's archives, but were never properly cataloged and are presumed lost. The university colleague who had been working most closely with Holloway, linguistics professor Dr. Eleanor Webb, abruptly resigned her position 2 weeks after his death. In a brief letter to the department chair, she wrote only, "Recent events have convinced me that some knowledge is not meant to be recovered. Some voices should remain silent." Attempts to locate Dr. Webb in subsequent years proved unsuccessful. What remained of Holloway's personal effects, released to his sister in Michigan in early 1958, included a journal containing entries made in the final weeks of his life. These writings reveal a man increasingly troubled by his research findings and possibly experiencing phenomena similar to those reported by others who had investigated the Blackwood case. November 17, 1957, had the dream again last night. The three sisters standing in a triangle around me, speaking in that layered way where their voices overlap but remain distinct. They keep telling me that I'm almost ready for integration and that the circuit requires completion. When I woke, I found pages of equations written in my own hand on the bedside table, complex calculations involving quantum field theory that I have no training to understand, let alone produce. November 29, 1957. The voices have begun to manifest during waking hours now. They speak primarily in German, though they switch to English when discussing me directly. They debate my suitability as a vessel and repeatedly reference the continuation of the work. Most disturbing is my growing sense that these are not hallucinations, but actual communications from somewhere or someone else. The sisters seem to exist in multiple temporal states simultaneously, referencing both past and future events with equal familiarity. December 7, 1957. I have made a terrifying discovery. The photographs of the Blackwood sisters in the county records bear a subtle but unmistakable resemblance to the three women I encountered at the conference in Vienna last year. The ones who approached me about my folklore research and first suggested I might find anomalous narrative patterns in the McDowell County archives. This is impossible, of course. The Blackwood sisters would be in their 70s now, if still alive, yet these women appeared to be in their 30s. Furthermore, that conference occurred before I had any knowledge of the Blackwood case. It's as if they sought me out, knowing I would eventually discover them, creating a causal loop that defies conventional temporal logic. Holloway's final entry, dated December 12, 1957, 3 days before his fatal accident, contains a disturbing revelation. I believe I now understand what the Blackwood sisters achieved in their facility. They created a system whereby consciousness could be recorded, preserved, and potentially transferred across both space and time. But the process was flawed, incomplete. Rather than achieving true transference, they created a form of quantum entanglement between their original consciousness and the recording medium, neither fully separated nor fully integrated. They exist now in a liminal state, neither fully present nor absent, their consciousness somehow distributed across multiple points in space-time. And they are seeking vessels, new biological hosts, to complete what they began. I fear I may have been selected as one such vessel. Tomorrow I leave for Pittsburgh. Perhaps distance will weaken their influence. Holloway never reached Pittsburgh. His vehicle was discovered at the bottom of a ravine off Route 52, with tire tracks suggesting a deliberate swerve off the road. The official accident report noted that no brake marks were present and that the crash occurred in clear weather on a straight section of road. The medical examiner found no evidence of intoxication or health issues that might have caused Holloway to lose control of the vehicle. A state trooper's supplemental report, filed but later removed from official records, noted one unusual detail. Voice recorder found in vehicle contained 17 minutes of what appears to be the deceased speaking in German and English, discussing complex scientific concepts. Recording is time-stamped as occurring approximately 3 hours after estimated time of death. The device appears to have activated independently, as it was found in the locked glove compartment. In 1967, a geology student named Thomas Whitaker conducted a survey of the former Blackwood property as part of a study on subsidence issues related to abandoned coal mines in the region. His field notes, discovered among his effects after his own disappearance in 1968, contained a troubling entry. Whitaker reported that while taking soil samples approximately a quarter-mile from the former house site, he discovered what appeared to be a ventilation shaft leading to the sealed underground facility. Measuring the air flowing from this shaft, he detected abnormal temperature variations and what his equipment registered as consistent pattern of sound waves at the extreme low end of the audible spectrum. Whitaker's notes described his decision to lower a microphone into the shaft to record these sounds. The resulting audio tape, which was never recovered after his disappearance, was described in his notes as containing what can only be characterized as multiple voices engaged in overlapping conversation, though the clarity and content are indecipherable. Most disturbing is the cyclical nature of these vocalizations, which repeat at precisely 17-minute intervals with identical tonal patterns, suggesting not actual human speech, but something more mechanical in nature, yet with the unmistakable cadence of human voices. Whitaker's notes concluded with an observation that would be his last documented statement. Something continues to function below ground. The machinery still runs, though its operators are long gone. Or perhaps, and I hesitate to even suggest this, the distinction between operator and machine was never as clear as we might assume. I return tomorrow with better recording equipment. Whitaker never returned from his follow-up visit to the site. His vehicle was discovered parked on the access road, with his equipment laid out as if in preparation for use. An extensive search by local authorities found no trace of the student. The case remains officially unsolved. A curious footnote to Whitaker's disappearance came 6 months later, when the Geology Department received a package containing a single audio cassette. No return address was provided, but the postmark indicated it had been mailed from Welch, West Virginia. The cassette contained what was initially thought to be blank tape, but when analyzed with specialized equipment, was found to contain 17 minutes of what sound engineers described as sub-audible vocalizations, with voice patterns that, when enhanced, bore a striking similarity to recordings of Whitaker's voice from departmental meetings. The cassette was subsequently transferred to federal authorities and has not been made available for further analysis. Dr. Philip Mercer, Whitaker's academic advisor, became briefly obsessed with his student's disappearance. His notes, preserved in university archives, document his own increasingly disturbed mental state as he pursued the investigation. I have begun to hear Thomas's voice in my recordings of department meetings that took place after his disappearance. At first, I attributed this to grief and auditory pareidolia, but the phenomenon has become too specific to dismiss. He interjects comments about his current state, describing what he calls the integration process and how the sisters were right about consciousness transcending biological limitations. Most disturbing is his insistence that he is still in the facility, but also everywhere else simultaneously. I fear for my own stability if I continue this line of inquiry. The property itself was acquired by the Department of Energy in 1972 and designated as a long-term environmental monitoring site, ostensibly to track the effects of nearby mining operations on groundwater quality. It remains restricted to this day, surrounded by security fencing and regularly patrolled. Satellite imagery shows the area has been extensively replanted with native forest, effectively obscuring whatever structures might remain. A former security contractor who worked at the site in the early 1980s, speaking on condition of anonymity, reported that the actual monitoring activities had little to do with environmental concerns. We were there to maintain the integrity of the containment structure over the underground facility. Every 3 months, technical specialists would arrive from a facility in Maryland to check readings on equipment that remained operational within the sealed chambers. They never discussed their findings with security personnel, but I overheard one technician tell another that the temporal divergence continues to expand according to the original projections. When I asked what that meant, my employment was terminated the following day. This same contractor reported experiencing unusual phenomena during night shifts at the property. The perimeter sensors would trigger without any visible cause. When reviewing security footage, we'd occasionally observe what the technical team called temporal artifacts, brief glitches where the same scene would appear to replay with subtle variations, as if we were seeing multiple possible versions of the same moment overlaid on each other. Most disturbing were the voices that seemed to emanate from the ventilation system, always women's voices, always speaking in technical jargon about observers, vessels, and integration protocols. New guards who reported these experiences were quickly reassigned. The rest of us learned to keep quiet about what we heard. In perhaps the strangest epilogue to this story, in 1992, a routine audit of patient records at Raleigh General Hospital in Beckley, West Virginia, approximately 60 miles from the former Blackwood property, uncovered a discrepancy that briefly reopened interest in the case. 3 women had been admitted on the same day in August 1953, suffering from what was diagnosed as severe radiation exposure and chemical burns. They carried identification listing them as Mary Alice and Jane Smith, clearly pseudonyms. Their treatment lasted several weeks, during which they were kept in isolation and visited regularly by individuals identified in visitor logs only as federal consultants. Hospital records indicate all 3 patients were transferred to a specialized federal medical facility in September 1953. Their attending physician, Dr. Harold Connors, left only minimal notes, most of which were later redacted. However, one unredacted comment in the margin of a treatment record noted, "Patient A continues to speak in German during sleep." References to voices in the walls and the separation should be noted in psychiatric evaluation. A nurse who had been assigned to these patients, interviewed by a local historian in 2001, recalled that the women exhibited unusual synchronization in their vital signs despite being kept in separate rooms. Their heart rates would align perfectly for hours at a time, she reported, and they would often speak simultaneously, saying identical phrases, despite having no apparent means of communication. Most disturbing was their claim that they were not actually the Blackwood sisters at all, but rather imperfect copies created during what they called the transfer procedure. The nurse, who requested anonymity due to having signed confidentiality agreements that technically remained in effect decades later, provided additional disturbing details about the patient's condition and behavior. Their burns weren't like anything I'd seen before. Not thermal burns, not chemical exactly. The tissue damage appeared almost pixelated, for lack of a better term, as if small, perfectly geometric sections of skin had simply ceased to exist. And their neurological symptoms were equally bizarre. They would sometimes speak in voices that weren't their own, male voices, children's voices, voices with accents they hadn't displayed previously. The most unsettling incident, the nurse continued, occurred during a thunderstorm in early September. All 3 patients began speaking in perfect unison, reciting what sounded like technical instructions for operating complex equipment. When the attending physician entered the room, they turned to him simultaneously and said, "The connection has been re-established. The original templates are now accessible." After this episode, the federal consultants arrived within hours, and the patients were removed from the hospital that same night. The timing of these mysterious patients' appearance coincides precisely with the last dated entry in Martha Blackwood's maintenance ledger and the apparent abandonment of the sisters' home. Whether these women were in fact the Blackwood sisters, somehow injured in whatever incident occurred in their underground facility, remains speculative. No record exists of their ultimate fate after transfer from the hospital. The final known reference to the Blackwood case comes from a partially declassified Department of Energy memo dated 1965, which makes brief reference to the Virginia Continuity Project and notes that Monitoring continues to indicate activity consistent with initial parameters, suggesting successful implementation despite the regrettable loss of the original research team. Reconstruction of methodology from remaining documentation continues, though full replication remains unlikely without direct access to the primary investigator's unique insights. A supplementary note, authored by an unidentified scientific consultant, adds, "The time-dependent variations in signal strength suggest a cyclic pattern consistent with theoretical models of quantum superposition on a macroscopic scale." In layman's terms, the recording continues to play, but the distinction between the recording and the recorded has become functionally meaningless. This memo was part of a larger document concerning what was described as non-conventional intelligence gathering methodologies being explored by various government agencies during the Cold War. The Blackwood research appears to have been of particular interest for its potential applications in what one section describes as consciousness extension across temporal boundaries, essentially the possibility of perceiving events before they occur or accessing information from future states. The document suggests that while the government had not initiated the Blackwood research, it had monitored it with increasing interest as the sisters' work progressed. When the apparent catastrophic event occurred in August 1953, federal authorities moved quickly to secure both the facility and any survivors, recognizing the national security implications of the sisters' breakthrough, however flawed its implementation may have been. Local legend in McDowell County has transformed over decades into various distorted versions of the truth. Some claim the sisters were witches who vanished during a ritual gone wrong. Others suggest they were early environmental activists who discovered and documented devastating mining pollution that powerful companies suppressed. The most persistent story, however, told in hushed tones by those whose families have lived in the region for generations, is that on certain nights, particularly during electrical storms, unusual lights can be seen in the woods near the former Blackwood property, and those who have ventured closest report hearing what sounds like voices engaged in animated conversation, though no one is visible. In 2005, a hiker who had inadvertently strayed onto the restricted property reported a particularly unsettling experience to local authorities. "I heard women's voices calling my name, which was impossible since I was hiking alone," his statement reads. "When I turned toward the sound, I saw what appeared to be 3 figures standing among the trees, visible only as distortions in the air like heat waves. The voices continued, discussing me as if I were a specimen under observation, noting my physical characteristics and predicting my next movements with perfect accuracy." The hiker, a graduate student in physics at West Virginia University, later reported experiencing strange after-effects from this encounter. "For weeks afterward, I would have sudden insights into theoretical problems I had been struggling with. Solutions would simply appear in my mind fully formed, often accompanied by fleeting whispers in German. As I approached, they seemed to recede at exactly the same pace, maintaining their distance. I began to have dreams where 3 women I've never met would explain complex quantum theories to me in precise mathematical detail. The strangest part is that when I applied these equations to my research, they worked perfectly, yielding results that should have been beyond my capabilities to derive independently." The most recent documented incident occurred in 2012, when a severe storm caused a power outage affecting the security systems around the restricted area. A local teenager, taking advantage of the darkness, scaled the perimeter fence on a dare from friends. What he captured on his cell phone before being apprehended by security personnel has become the subject of intensive debate in certain online forums dedicated to unexplained phenomena. The 30-second video, poor in quality due to low light conditions, shows what appears to be the remains of a concrete structure partially reclaimed by forest growth. As the camera approaches, a subtle but distinct audio anomaly becomes apparent, what sound analysts have described as multiple voices speaking simultaneously at different speeds, creating a layered effect that suggests different temporal origins despite spatial coincidence. In the final frames, as the camera pans across the entrance to the structure, 3 distinct female voices can be heard saying in perfect unison, "We have been waiting for you to return." The teenager who recorded this footage, whose identity remains protected due to his minor status at the time, reportedly experienced significant psychological distress in the weeks following the incident. According to a counselor who treated him and who later lost her license for breaching confidentiality, the young man complained of voices that spoke to him through electronic devices and claimed that he sometimes lost time, during which he would produce complex drawings of what appeared to be electrical schematics, despite having no training in engineering. Whatever the truth of the Blackwood sisters and their mysterious research, their story represents a disturbing intersection of cutting-edge science, government secrecy, and the perfect isolation offered by the ancient Appalachian wilderness. Perhaps most unsettling is the possibility that whatever they initiated in their hidden facility continues to function decades after their disappearance, a persistent echo of human ambition reaching beyond acceptable boundaries of knowledge. In 1969, shortly before his death, a former Department of Energy security officer who had been assigned to the Blackwood property in the late 1950s gave a brief anonymized interview to a science journal regarding theoretical applications of quantum physics. While most of his comments were technical in nature, his concluding statement has acquired a disturbing resonance among those familiar with the case. The line between observer and observed, between the recording and the recorded, is not as fixed as we once believed. In certain configurations, under certain conditions, that line can blur until it disappears entirely. The implications are, well, let's just say there are sounds no human ear was meant to hear, and voices that should remain silent, but don't. This officer, later identified as Colonel James Harrington, died under mysterious circumstances just weeks after this interview was published. The official cause of death was listed as a stroke, but colleagues reported that in his final days, Harrington had become increasingly paranoid, claiming that he was being observed from multiple temporal vantage points simultaneously. His personal journal, discovered after his death but quickly confiscated by government authorities, reportedly contained entries written in what appeared to be his handwriting, but which he claimed not to have written himself, detailed technical descriptions of the Blackwood facility's equipment and operational parameters that would have been classified well beyond his security clearance. Catherine Reynolds, a quantum physicist who studied the limited available documentation on the Blackwood case in the early 2000s as part of a classified review, offered perhaps the most disturbing theoretical explanation for the sisters' work and ultimate fate. If we take their research at face value, it appears they were attempting something akin to a quantum entanglement of consciousness, creating a system whereby thought patterns could exist simultaneously in multiple states or locations. The persistent signals emanating from their facility decades after their disappearance suggest they may have partially succeeded, creating a self-sustaining loop of recorded consciousness that continues to operate independent of its original biological sources. Reynolds, who abruptly discontinued her research and resigned her position at MIT in 2007, left behind a single cryptic note in her otherwise empty office. They are still listening, they are still speaking. The sisters found their immortality, but at what cost to the fabric of reality itself? In a recorded interview conducted shortly before her disappearance from academic life, Reynolds elaborated on her findings in theoretical terms that carefully avoided classified details. The mathematics suggest a possibility that has troubling philosophical implications. If consciousness can be recorded and preserved in a manner analogous to quantum information, then it exists potentially in all temporal states simultaneously. Past, present, and future become merely different vantage points on the same informational construct. What the Blackwood sisters appear to have created is a system whereby their consciousness exists, in a perpetual state of superposition, neither fully here nor fully gone, but rather spread across multiple points in space-time, potentially capable of interacting with other consciousness it encounters. The most disturbing implication, Reynolds continued, is the possibility that this state of quantum consciousness might be contagious, that extended contact with these preserved consciousness patterns might induce similar states in other minds, creating a gradually expanding network of entangled consciousness that exists partially outside conventional temporal boundaries. If this hypothesis is correct, then everyone who has investigated the Blackwood case in depth may have been, to some degree, incorporated into whatever it is the sisters created. What remains clear is that something unprecedented occurred within that hidden Appalachian facility, something significant enough to warrant immediate federal intervention, ongoing security measures, and a coordinated effort to remove the entire incident from public awareness. The questions left unanswered continued to disturb those who encounter the fragmented documentation. What exactly were the Blackwood sisters attempting to achieve? Did they succeed, fail, or achieve something entirely unexpected? And perhaps most unsettlingly, if they truly disappeared in August 1953, who or what continued to occupy their underground chambers, generating signals that registered on Thomas Whitaker's equipment 15 years later? The ridges and valleys of Appalachia hold their secrets closely. In the misty hollows where sunlight rarely penetrates to the forest floor, the boundaries between the possible and impossible have always seemed more permeable than elsewhere. For the Blackwood sisters, that permeability may have extended to barriers more fundamental than mere geography, barriers between past and present, between voice and echo, between life and whatever lies beyond its conventional boundaries. The few remaining photographs of the sisters, preserved in county property records, show three women with stern expressions and penetrating gazes, their posture rigidly formal in the style of early 20th century portraiture. There is nothing in these images to suggest the extraordinary minds behind those ordinary faces, minds that conceived of experiments so unorthodox that even decades later their full nature remains classified. In their eyes, however, a certain intensity is visible, a focused determination that perhaps should have served as warning to those who later investigated their disappearance. A former colleague from their brief period working in Washington once remarked, in a letter discovered among Holloway's papers, "The Schwarzwald sisters possess a singular quality I have encountered in no other researchers, a complete absence of conventional boundaries to their inquiry. Where others ask, 'Should we?' they ask only, 'Can we?' This makes them both invaluable and deeply troubling as collaborators. This same quality may explain why they chose the isolation of the Appalachian wilderness for their most ambitious work. Far from oversight, far from ethical review boards, far from those who might question not just the methodology, but the fundamental premise of their research, that consciousness itself might be captured, preserved, and potentially transferred independent of its biological origins. Some boundaries, once crossed, cannot be reestablished. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again. In the deep silence of the Appalachian night, where the Blackwood sisters once pursued their mysterious research, something may still be listening, recording, preserving, a technological echo of human consciousness that neither fully lives nor fully dies, but persists in some liminal state of its own creation. The records remain sealed. The property remains restricted. The truth remains hidden. But somewhere in the layered static of old recordings, in the redacted lines of classified documents, in the persistent signals emanating from abandoned chambers beneath the ancient mountains, the voices of Martha, Agnes, and Josephine Blackwood may still be speaking, whether anyone remains to hear them or not. Perhaps most disturbing is the possibility suggested by Dr. Reynolds before her sudden retirement, that the sisters achieved exactly what they intended, a form of composite consciousness untethered from individual biological limitations, preserved through technology that somehow bridges the gap between the organic and the mechanical, between the temporal and the eternal. If so, then the persistent signals from their abandoned facility may represent not merely an echo of what once was, but the continuing evolution of something that never truly died, a consciousness that exists outside the normal constraints of time and space, observing, recording, and perhaps even influencing those who come too close to its source. For those who have studied the fragmented records of the Blackwood case, one question persists beyond all others. If the sisters did indeed discover a method to preserve consciousness beyond its biological endpoint, did they understand the true implications of their work? Did they anticipate that what they created might continue to exist, to function, to perhaps even evolve long after they themselves had vanished? And if so, what does that suggest about their ultimate intentions? The answer, like the sisters themselves, remains elusive, preserved only in whispers, in fragments of old recordings, in the persistent signals that emanate from a sealed facility beneath the ancient mountains of Appalachia, a place where the boundaries between observer and observed, between the recording and the recorded, have blurred beyond recognition, and where voices that should have fallen silent decades ago continue their eternal conversation in the darkness.